Now, let's continue our conversation here about Corinth and the importance of understanding some of the details. Because it is in the midst of this decadence that Paul establishes. Now, from the most ancient of times, Corinth was a busy trading center, boasting the best harbor in the Corinthian Gulf. But in the year somewhere around 146 BC before Christ, somewhere at about that time period, the Roman army under Mumicius destroyed the city and left it completely empty, selling all the surviving inhabitants into slavery. So literally, there was not one person left. The Roman army literally killed everybody, and whoever was surviving, okay, they were sold off, every single one of them, as slaves. Then the army went through just to prove their point and killed every beast that they can find. It didn't matter if it was a dog, a rat, or a cat. They just annihilated everything. And it was declared as off limits. And for 100 years, Corinth laid wasted, empty. No one was allowed to go there. It was left completely empty, selling all the surviving inhabitants into slavery. Corinth laid literally and utterly desolate for a full century, 100 years. 100 years later, however, Julius Caesar made the decision to rebuild the city, populating it mainly with free slaves. See, under the Roman Empire, even as cruel as they were, but slaves could earn their freedom. And now, about the time that Julius Caesar now comes into power, he is now the ruling emperor of the empire. Now he's got a problem. He's got two big problems, in fact. Okay? Well, actually, he never had a problem. They were just slight challenges to him is really what they were. But here are the two problems. He was now coming into an era where they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds upon hundreds, literally, slaves that were being freed. They earned their freedom. Right? And you can earn your freedom a number of different ways. That's not the important part. The important part is that you had hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds. And it's now literally into the thousands of slaves that have now come free. And they had earned their freedom. And one of the promises that was made to them was they could be shipped back home. But the problem is that many of them didn't want to go back home because they were so disconnected of years of slavery that the only thing they knew was the Roman Empire. And that was that they were promised a place to live. Secondly, you had all these Roman soldiers who had served faithfully in the Roman army. They were now either retiring generals, captains, lieutenants, and so forth and so forth, and many foot soldiers who had served faithfully, and they were also promised a place, okay, where they can live. So Julius Caesar made the decision he's going to rebuild Corinth. And when he rebuilt Corinth, okay, he understood there was a number of different things. He remembers what the history tells him, okay? The historians told him that Corinth was a very rich place in its heyday because of its shipping. He had to control all of his shipping as well. So here was the plan in brief. He sends all of the free slaves and all of the retired soldiers with their families, whole, complete, ships after ships after ships after ships, and they rebuild Corinth. And it is now populated now with free slaves from all over the world, and there are literally hundreds, okay, of traditions and languages, okay, and paganism and heathenism, right, among all these slaves as well as the soldiers. These were no angels either. And they now come together as free men, no longer having to serve under inscription, whether it be in the army or slavery. Now they were free and they're living among themselves. And it did not take long for decadence to set in. So Corinth in Paul's time was completely Roman in culture. Completely Roman in culture. It became a resort town, always crowded, always busy, and always filled with travelers. It developed a reputation for debauchery. That's what it developed a reputation for. The chief attractions in Corinth were the pagan temples that were served by prostitutes, and it had lots of temples. The pagan religions of the Greek and the Roman world had made fornication into a religious sacrament. Listen to me. Fornication became a religious sacrament in that culture. And Corinth became the focal point for that kind of profane, decadent worship. The entire city was filled with brothels. Row after row of them are still visible today in the ruins of Corinth. Ritual fornication had become so deeply ingrained in the Corinthian culture that in the first century, when you said to Corinthianize, that phrase, to Corinthianize, that specific phrase, to Corinthianize, was a synonym for sexual immorality. And a Corinthian girl was a euphemism for a prostitute. So you never called her a prostitute, you said that's a Corinthian girl. Everyone knew that Corinth was a city of unbridled vice. It was analogous to the modern-day Las Vegas, except that its chief attractions were temples rather than the casinos. That was much to my surprise when I was in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, in Holland. We arrived there on the plane, and we had this long layover, so we took the local train in. We're going to wait around just to explore the city. And lo and behold, we had no clue what we had walked into. We were completely lost. And all of a sudden, we're in the street, and it's just one brothel after another, after another, after another, after another. And it's out in the open, and the windows are open. And it's just, I was just stunned to see how open and decadent, but how normal it was in Amsterdam. That's how it was in Corinth. It was very normal. This was perhaps not the most auspicious place to plant a church in Corinth. But Corinth also had a large community of Jews and an active and centrally located synagogue. And there is where Paul found an open door for the gospel. In Romans chapter 5, just briefly go there. In Romans chapter 5, I want you to see in verse 20 what it says. The law came in so that the transgression would increase. Where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. This is exactly what was going to happen here in Corinth. When Paul presents the gospel, okay, when the law of God comes in, it now highlights, it illuminates, it shines its light upon all of the decadence, and now the decadence even grows even larger. Now you can see it with great clarity. In Acts chapter 18, tells the story of how the church in Corinth was founded in Acts chapter 18. Turn your Bibles to Acts chapter 18. And this is when Paul came to Corinth. He met Priscilla and Aquila, if you remember. Priscilla and Aquila, who happened to be skilled in the same craft as Apostle Paul was. They were tent makers. They were making tents. So they had something very similar, okay? They had something very in common with each other immediately. Look with me in Acts chapter 18. Look at verse 2 and 3. And he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla. Because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, he came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. Now, you recall earlier that I explained to you that in Rome, at the time when it was being, they had to accommodate all the free slaves. They had to accommodate all of the soldiers who have now already met their obligations in military service, including all those who had retired. And so them together with all of their families go to Corinth. Corinth is rebuilt. And now Claudius is now the emperor at this point. he now decides to clean out Rome, the city of Rome, with all the Jews. And where do you think he sent them to? Corinth. Why? Because it was a place of decadence. Now, Paul stayed in the home of Priscilla and Aquila, okay? And they worked alongside them during the week, and then every Sabbath, okay, he would go with them to the synagogue and preach the gospel. This is what he would do. In Acts chapter 18, verse 4. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. This is now how this church is founded at the beginning. But notice the twist and the turns that take place here. They became devoted, lifelong friends of Paul, fellow Christians, and co-laborers with him in his ministry. Now just turn and let's look at a number of scriptures together. Acts chapter 18:18. Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria, and with him were Priscilla and Aquila in Cenchrea. He had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. So I want you to understand what is taking place. Paul is a Jew, working among Jews there, okay? And so he keeps his vow there. In Romans 16:3, it says, greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. This is where he's talking to who these people were. In 1 Corinthians 16:19, it says, the churches of Asia greet you. Aquila and Priscilla greet you heartily in the Lord with the church that is in their house. Okay? So there was a house there. In 2 Timothy 4:19, it says, greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Okay? And so we can clearly see here, and he was a slave. He was a slave here. In addition to that, people are now coming together. Key people are now coming together in the ministry of Paul. Silas and Timothy also joined Paul in the missionary work at Corinth. Go back to Acts 18, verse 5. It says, but when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, which is on the northern part of Greece, which is Macedonia, Achaia is the southern part of Greece. So they came down from Macedonia. Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But so I want you to understand, all of his work was primarily with Jews in Corinth. However, there is a turning point. There is a turning point now here in Corinth came when most of the Jews in the synagogue refused Paul's teaching. They knew who he was, but there came a point when the Jews began to reject the teaching of Paul. Look at Acts chapter 18, verse 6, please. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, your blood be on your own heads. And Paul said, I am clean, for now I will go to the Gentiles. This became the major turning point in the Corinthian church, where it's going to be birthed, okay? And it will now become primarily Gentiles. Up until this point, the Corinthian church has been birthed and is mostly Jews. However, the overwhelming majority of the Jews reject Paul and his teaching, specifically his teaching. So what happens? Paul, he moved in with a Gentile named Justus, who happened to live immediately adjacent to the synagogue. He's literally living next door to the synagogue. And of course, Paul kept preaching the gospel, but now the focus of his ministry was the marketplace and the Gentile communities. So Paul was no longer literally allowed to come into the synagogue. So he would come out. He's living next door in Justus' house. So instead of coming out the door and walking into the synagogue, he walked out, hung right, and went off to the marketplace and to where all the Gentiles happened to be. And that's where he began to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, some Jews did respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And this is where it gets really interesting. Right? In Acts 18:8, Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Gentile Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. So now, in the synagogue, you have a leader in the synagogue, okay? So that would be like the local pastor of a local church, okay? And so he is the main leader in that same synagogue, Crispus, okay? Everybody falls under him. He is the main teacher and preacher of the word. He is the head, the administrative head of the synagogue. He comes to Christ. Him and his household, it says. He comes to Christ, along with many other Gentiles in the community. And this is why the majority of the Corinthian church were Gentiles from pagan backgrounds. This is really crucial to understand. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 2, this is what we're told. You know that when you were pagans, you were led astray to the mute idols. However, you were led. So clearly, they come from a pagan background. Corinth was one of the most fruitful mission fields the Apostle Paul ever visited. This is the place to go. As the church there was beginning to grow, this is what Luke says. Luke is the author of the book of Acts. So in Acts chapter 18, look with me, verses 9 and 10. Verses 9 and 10. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you. For I have many people in this city. So God guaranteed him, he says, I have many people in this city. God has many people in your city. He has many people in your city that you are to reach. So Paul's evangelistic ministry continued for a year and a half before he met any serious resistance. Can you imagine? For a year and a half, Paul is preaching on a daily basis the gospel of Jesus Christ. And on a daily basis, people are coming to Christ. They're coming to Christ. Jews are being added, but by and large, the majority are Gentiles. They're coming into the fold. Then around July, the month of July, in the year 51 A.D., a man named Gallio became the new Roman proconsul of Achaia, which is the southern part of Greece, okay? And so he's now the proconsul. He is now in charge of that entire region, and he's working for the Roman government. Now, the Jewish community was not happy with Paul. They came to a place of pure hatred against Paul. So the Jewish community in Corinth tried to seize the opportunity to make trouble for Paul. They go, now we got a new proconsul, let's approach him. So they probably thought that they could exploit Gallio's inexperience and convince him to imprison Paul or drive him from Corinth. They wanted one of two things: put him in prison or get him out of here. Okay? So this is what Acts 18, look at verse 12 and 13 says. But while Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews, with one accord and one voice, together, unanimous, rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. We're not talking about Roman law, we're talking about Jewish law. Okay? And it says that with one accord, they rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. This is the place called the Bema seat, or the Bema seat, or the Bema seat in the center of Corinth, okay? And this was, they brought him to the Agora. The Agora is the marketplace. This is where they brought him to, okay? And they said, this man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. So these are Jews. They're in power. Remember, this is a free state. if you will. Corinth is a free state. And now they bring him to Gallio, and they're hoping that Gallio, because he's inexperienced, he doesn't know much about the province yet, okay? And so they're going to catch him in early in his administration and convince him to either have Paul beaten, okay, punished, imprisoned, or driven out of Corinth. Now, Gallio was that stupid. He may have been inexperienced as a proconsul, but he was not a stupid man. So he wisely dismissed their charges, the charges of the Jews against Paul, saying he had no desire to intervene in an intramural squabble over the nuances of the Jewish religion. Now remember, as far as Rome was concerned, the difference between Judaism and Christianity is that it was a squabble within the same religion. That's how they looked at this. In Acts chapter 18, look at this in verse 14 and 15. Now notice that we're working our way down through this text. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you, to even bother listening to you. But if there are questions about words and names and your own law, okay, look after yourselves, for I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters. So he dismissed Paul. And look at Acts 18:16. And he drove them away from the judgment seat. He literally, he was fed up with them. This is the first time they're meeting him, okay? And this is literally what takes place here. This is what's going to set up, okay, the major confrontation, which finally solidifies, okay, Paul's grip hold on his leadership, and it becomes the foundation for establishing the church in Corinth.